Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and joining us for this webinar. We're going to be covering a lot of topics over the next, 3 or 4 hours that this session goes. Just kidding. It's only going to be about 45 minutes. And it's an HR-driven conversation. This is for all of you that either have employees or thinking about getting employees. I want to cover and I have 10 employees in my business. I want to get along and cover some of the bigger issues that are affecting us. And the best thing about this session is that although I will be talking and discussing and giving some of my thoughts, really the star of the show is Shanna. Shanna is the one that's going to be joining me in this conversation. So first of all, who am I? My name is Gene Marks. I own a company called the Marks Group PC. I do have 10 employees. We're based outside of Philadelphia. I also write every day on small business and public policy for the Washington Post. And then I also write weekly for Forbes and Inc.com and Entrepreneur.com as well. So I cover a lot of areas that affect all of us running small businesses. And obviously employment, HR issues, employment law, that comes, that drives a lot of what we do. So I'm really, really interested in hearing some of the things that Shanna's got to say. I've got a bunch of questions for her. Shanna, just for a few seconds, a brief introduction of yourself and what you do and who you are.
Sure. My name is Shanna Wall. Hello, everyone. I am a labor law attorney here at Comply Right. I do a lot of the legal research and content development on our next generation of products. I have owned a small business as well in my previous life. I've been practicing law for over 10 years, and I'm very excited to be with you on this webinar as well.
That's great. And Shanna, how happy are you that you chose to specialize in labor law? It seems to be a growth industry. Am I wrong?
It's ever-changing, I will tell you that. There's something new to learn almost every day, and the laws are constantly changing, so I'm staying on my toes.
Yeah, I believe it. Whenever I talk to my clients and other business owners, a lot of people, when we start going over issues in the workplace, I can't tell you how many times people will raise their eyebrows and be like, I picked the wrong profession, man. I should have been a labor attorney. So good job. You did the right thing. You're in a great field. So, okay, so we've got a lot to talk about. Basically, today's conversation, and guys, by the way, this is not going to be some kind of intense PowerPoint-driven thing. It's a conversation that we're going to be having about issues that are affecting our companies, our employees, our workplace. We're going to be covering certain issues that affect employee performance. We're going to be covering issues about sustaining your business through proper planning and designing of good policies that will affect your employees and your workforce. Some thoughts and things that will affect your retaining of employees, and then, of course, the laws themselves. I'm not going to be covering this in order. We're going to be covering this in all different ways as we have our conversation. Here's what we will be doing in order. I'll break it out into about 10 or so minutes of conversation on these big topics. I want to drive into some of the things you need to know about record keeping, what records you need to be keeping for your company, certain best practices for doing that, and certain rules and laws that you have to comply with. Your employee handbook in 2018, it's a huge issue. Workplace issues are affecting your ability to find people, retain people, and also stay out of trouble. And a lot of it comes down to what's in your employee handbook. So Shanna and I are going to be talking about that as well. We're going to talk about job applications and interviews and just some thoughts on staying out of trouble when you are doing job postings, job descriptions, certain things to say and not say in a job interview. And finally, disciplinary issues. These are all sort of topics that are going to affect us in the, what to do when you have certain things that come up with inside your company among your employees and how to handle them and what to do. So, each one of these topics could be their own webinar. So I apologize in advance if we don't get to everything that we might want to do, but what I will tell you is this. Post your questions to the chat window, the Q&A window. Grab it. We'll make sure that we grab it, and then Shanna's going to be doing a Q&A podcast, which that time and date will be given later, so that you can have your questions answered. But I want to try and fill the next 45 minutes with as much facts for you as possible. So, Shanna, let's get going, right? I mean, when I talk about record keeping, when business owners hear about record keeping, there's a bunch of stuff that that people need to know, and some of the basics that they do need to follow. And so let me, I'm going to jump around a little bit here, because I'm going to start with the question that always does get asked the most, and then maybe you can cover some of these bullet points by my initial question, which is keeping records. How long do we keep records? I mean, what do you say, Shanna, when a client or a customer asks you this question? How long do we keep records around?
Well, that's actually a really complex question, because there are various laws that surround these rules, these record retention laws. When you're talking federally, you're looking at laws such as the ADA, which is Americans with Disabilities Act. You're looking at the ADEA, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. You're looking at OSHA. You're looking at HIPAA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, FMLA, ERISA. There's so many federal laws that are going to dictate. And actually, some of them even overlap here. So whereas, you want to keep things like when you start off your job postings and your job advertisements, you're going to want to keep those for a year under the ADEA, for example.
Well, is there like a rule of thumb? I mean, if you were to say, listen, if you keep all of your records at least X amount of years, you should be okay, regardless of the federal or state requirements. Is there a rule of thumb?
There's no real rule of thumb, because it varies. Because, like I said, most things you're going to want to keep at least a year, but OSHA can go up to as many as 30 years, for example. And what's required under state law, under federal law, might not be even have a requirement under state law, for example. So whereas you need to keep job applications and resumes under federal law, you might not need those under state law. State law might only dictate how long you need to keep accident reports or payroll records, for example. So there's no real rule of thumb, and it all varies depending on what the record actually is itself.
Well, considering all the different organizations out there that we have to answer to, it almost seems like the best thing to do is to just keep all records for all the time. I mean, is that what I mean? Like, otherwise, I mean, I'm confused as a business owner. Like if I decide to trash some employee records, and we'll talk about what we mean by records in a minute, but if I decide to trash an employee file, I don't know if the state might have longer rules or the federal government has longer rules. It just seems safest to keep it. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but at the same time, if you do that, you could be opening yourself up to potential liability that you don't need to have. For example, one of the documents that's important to keep is the Form I-9. That's basically your work authorization under federal law. It's the form that everyone has to fill out, giving whatever their work authorization forms are, whether it's your Social Security number or your driver's license, your passport, your any other kinds of work authorizations that are allowed for the Form I-9. You have to keep that for 3 years from the date of hire, or 1 year following separation of employment from that separation from that when that employee leaves your employment. And
right.
The reason why you do want to get rid of these when the time has expired is because if you have a mistake on that, each mistake that a government official finds on those forms can lead to a penalty. And it's not just one, like if you have 10 mistakes on the form, it's not like you just get one penalty. You will get 10 penalties if you have 10 mistakes. So if you keep those past the retention form, they can look at them even if they should have been thrown away, and you can still be charged with penalties even if you didn't need to have those. So things like that, you do want to get rid of. Other things like payroll records, once they've passed, you might want to consider getting rid of them in case somebody tries to come back 10 years later and say that you didn't pay them correctly. Obviously, there's state statute of limitation laws and stuff, but if you keep things longer than you need to, that could be discoverable and used against you if you were underpaying your employees. So there are things that you do want to consider getting rid of once that retention period has expired. And I do understand that it is very confusing because the length of time that might be required under state law could be different than federal law. So you have to do whichever one is the longest. So, for example, if something is just a year under federal, and it actually conflicts with another federal law that says you have to keep them 3 years, you want to go ahead and keep them the 3 years. So it is a real difficult area to keep track of,
okay.
And to know which one applies.
So let's step back one thing. You mentioned about I-9s, okay?
Sure.
I don't want to leave this slide without at least asking, when we talk about specific employee information, for anybody that I hire, Shanna, what information should I be keeping on all of these employees?
Okay, so basically there's kind of like 3 buckets or 3 types of data that you should be keeping on your employees. First of all, you're going to want to keep personnel information, and this is going to include things like the personal contact information, your employee's address, their date of birth, social security number if that's applicable, their phone number, who to contact in case of an emergency, those general information items. But you're also, in that personnel file, you're going to want to keep things about the hiring information. That could be your job posting, that could be their resume, it could be their job application, their offer letter. You're also going to need to keep things like their performance records, any disciplinary documentation that you have. That could include reviews, salary increases, even write-ups for disciplinary reasons. And I know we're going to get into this in a little bit, but handbooks, you want to keep a receipt of their acknowledgement that they received the handbook, or if you just give one-off policies that they received that actual policy, those are things you're going to want to keep. If you're required to do any kinds of training, whether that's through OSHA or a lot of states now are requiring sexual harassment trainings, if you need acknowledgments for those, employee contracts, non-compete agreements, if your state allows those. Anything that has to do with the end of employment documentation, whether that's a resignation letter, an exit interview, anything like that. That's all going to fall under your personnel information. Then the second bucket would be your payroll information. So that could be your timesheets. That could be direct deposit authorizations. That could be attendance records, garnishment records, raises, bonuses, anything associated with paychecks, things like that. And then finally, you're also going to need to keep any medical records, medical information that you might need. For example, if an employee needs to take sick leave, or if you're big enough and you're in a state where you have to give family and medical leave, you might need the medical records for that. Drug tests, if you do drug testing, health insurance forms, even doctor's notes if a person's out because of sickness or tardiness, things like that, and it's because due to medical reasons. All those you're going to need to keep also. And I say that these are 3 buckets because really you should ideally be keeping these in 3 separate different folders. Instead of just having one folder for each employee, you really should have at least 3 folders for each employee. Because this is important because especially with medical records, we know that those are protected under HIPAA, for example. And so certain people don't need access to medical records, but they might need access to the person's contact information, for example, if there was an emergency. It's really about access that you're given access to.
Shanna, what are your thoughts then about having these records on paper versus electronic? Is there any, from a legal standpoint, is there any difference between the two? Is there any recommended storage that you would recommend?
Legally, you could do it either way. It's really just going to be a business decision. What I would say, there's obviously pros and cons to both. Paper records, you're not going to have to worry about security issues, like if you're housing the records on a server or in the cloud. Obviously you're going to have to take security issues into account.
Sure.
But, paper, you might not have to take that into account. You could lock it up in a file, for example. But you also have to think about accessibility. Keeping things in the cloud or on a drive, it might just be a lot easier for you, because if you're traveling a lot, you'll have access to it outside of the office, or a natural disaster like a fire or a flood, for example, could damage and completely destroy any physical records, whereas that might not be the case with the digital records. So there's definitely pros and cons. It's kind of a business decision. Legally speaking, there's really no difference. You could keep either or both.
Sounds good. All right, that's great. All right, so the record-keeping takeaways, we basically want to keep everything that we have to document about an employee from the time that they apply all the way to the time that they leave the company. We want to keep it segregated based on the buckets that Shanna talked about. And finally, I got to tell you, my takeaway from this conversation as well is that because all the rules are so different about how long we should be keeping and maintaining records, I would probably bring in a labor attorney for a couple hours, once a year or every other year to review the records that I have and make recommendations as to ones that I can keep and ones that I can take away. So let's move on to the next topic of conversation. We had mentioned before about employee handbooks. So for starters, Shanna, do you recommend that every company has an employee handbook, and exactly what is an employee handbook? What does it do?
Oh, okay. Well, I do recommend that everyone has a handbook. They're not required, although federal and state laws, there may be some one-off policies that are required that you give to your employees, and we might touch base on some of those specifically in a bit, depending on how our conversation goes. But really, the point of an employee handbook is twofold. It's really setting out the expectations for your employees, which we all know is very important. They need to know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But it also can protect you in a lawsuit. As if you have a policy and your employee breaks it, and you can cite that policy, and if they file a lawsuit for discrimination, for example, because you fired them, then you have this policy to fall back on, for example. So it is very important in that regard. So I do recommend that you have it, yes.
Fair enough. So let's assume we don't have an employee handbook in our company. How do we get started? What do we do to put one together?
Well, you're going to want to look at your business and what's important to your business. Every handbook should have some kinds of standards and conducts policy, for example. Like I said, what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior, and specifically what are the consequences for not behaving in the proper way. So that would be your discipline part of it. You really want to focus on especially a lot of people want to look at a handbook to find out how much time off they get. I mean, most employees, when they're hired, that's probably one of the first questions. What vacation time do I get? What sick time do I get? So you're going to want to lay out all of that. You're going to want to lay out what your expectations are in regards to work hours. Is your work going to be Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, for example? Is it shift work? How do they check if their schedule changes? Where do they go? It's all those types of things. And some people choose to put in dress policies depending on, is it a professional place that everybody needs to dress up, or is it more of a relaxed atmosphere where you can go casual? I know one of the newer trends now is even having a fragrance policy. Is perfume allowed, cologne allowed, because some people have allergies to that. So it's really going to depend on what your business needs are. But certain things I would definitely have would be, like I said, the attendance policy. Timekeeping is very important, especially for your non-exempt employees, which those would be the ones that are paid what you would consider hourly. Do they need to clock in? Do they need to clock out? Is it a punch clock? Is it signing something on just paper? Is it checking in on a computer? Like, how do they do that? If you're going to offer overtime, how do they get authorization to work overtime? Those kinds of things are what you're going to want to look at. And like I said just a minute ago, there are some specific things that you do have to have depending on your state law and federal law. For example, if you're a big enough an employer and you fall under the FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act, you have to let people know what their rights and responsibilities are under the FMLA. And several states now too, with paid sick time that is starting, that's kind of a new trend. States are basically forcing certain employers to provide paid sick leave. A lot of times, right, if that's the case, then they require you to give notice to your employees of what their rights and responsibilities are. And most employers might not even think about drug testing policies. So there are quite a few states actually that if you're going to test for drug testing, either before employment or randomly or however you're going to do it, you have to give them notice about that. And one way to do that is through a handbook policy.
It's fascinating you talk about drug testing. I just wrote about that in the post about how a lot of employers are starting to move away from drug testing, believe it or not. It depends on the industry and the business that you're in, but they're finding that they find a good employee, particularly if they're in a state where marijuana is legal, either recreational or for medicinal use, and more than half of the states in the country are like that. They're finding the employee might fail a drug test because of that, but they're a good candidate, and it's tight labor force. It's tough to walk away from somebody good, and these companies are loosening up their drug policies. I mean, some companies where they're dealing with hazardous materials or things or safety issues are still keeping it pretty tight, but it has just been a trend among a lot of small and medium-sized companies to kind of relax those policies. Shanna, what other sort of unique or hot employee handbook issues do you see popping up in 2018? I mean, I'm going to start you off with one. I'm assuming sexual harassment and office romances. That's got to be a big one, right? I mean,
yeah,
what about that one?
Again, that would be one of the ones that I would say are definitely a must-have. And when you're talking about sexual harassment and discrimination, another thing that differs between the states are what's actually a protected class. When you're talking about discrimination, it's, you're talking about, is it based on sex? First, is it based on religion? Is it based on age? Is it based on disability? And, federal has certain protected classes, those that I just mentioned, but the states can even go further. States now are adding transgender, sexual orientation, political affiliation, marital status, things like that. So it's not just about what you would think, I'm being discriminated against because I'm a woman or I'm being sexually harassed. You got to think about all those other issues. So that is definitely a really big hot topic right now, but that's one that you should have always had in your handbook anyway, so I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a trend to add it, maybe a trend to update it. And one thing that you really need to make sure your policy has, and small employers might not be aware of this, but you really need to have in your policy, how can you report discrimination and sexual harassment? What's the procedure? Who do you report it to? You want to make sure you have 2 contact names in there for them to actually report to, and preferably, if it's possible, a male and a female, and even in different departments, because, what if one of those people, what if you only have one person as the contact person, and that's the person that's discriminating or harassing someone? You're not going to feel comfortable going to that one person. Likewise, maybe a female would rather speak to another female as opposed to a male. So you want to make sure you have those types of things in that policy.
That's interesting. Now, some of the other handbook issues that have come up, and I only have a few minutes on the slide, but just to get some comments. I mean, office romance is in, and that kind of ties into the harassment issue. I mean, Facebook, for example. Did you know if you work at Facebook, you're only allowed to ask out somebody once, And if they turned you down, that's it. You can't ask about it again, or else you could be subject. And that's their policy. Whereas firms like Google and Microsoft, their policies are where just supervisors can't be dating subordinates. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on because office romance keeps coming up nowadays because of the whole sexual harassment issue. Do you have any thoughts on a good handbook policy for that?
Again, I think it's going to depend basically on your workforce and the size of your business. I mean, maybe that's not going to be an issue if you only have 2 employees, for example, But it is definitely something you want to consider because that, workplace romance with the asking out how many times you can ask out, when does it actually cross the line into harassment? Those are all, they're not real black and white. It's all a gray area. So you do want to define it out the best you can and what makes the most sense for your business.
Can I just say, but I think the important fact is that it's your policy, right, as a business owner. So you can set the policy, and if somebody does violate that policy, it's could potentially be grounds for termination, right? I mean, there's no laws guiding you there, or are there?
In regards to how many, what constitutes harassment and how many times you can ask somebody out, I'm not aware of any specific laws on that area.
Right.
But, yeah, when it comes to handbook policies, state laws and even local laws now, even down to the city level, they're getting so complex that you really have to make sure that, you do know if there is a state law that could affect that. Because just because they are your policies and you think you have a right to set it however you want, you might not even realize that there's a state law on that. Let's take weapons in the workplace, for example. People would think, yeah, it's my workplace, it's my property, I own it, I don't want any guns on my property. And that might be good and fine in one state, but take my state of Florida where I'm speaking to you from right now. We can't stop people from having a legally kept gun in a car on company property. As long as it's locked and the employee has a permit for that gun, you can't prohibit them from keeping it on your property in the car. You can stop them from bringing it actually into the office. But, that might be a nuance that most people aren't aware of. And Florida's not the only state. There are some others. So just because you think that, surely there's no rules on that state specifically, that just might not be the case.
Fair enough. All right, so the takeaways from here before we move on. Every company really should have an employee handbook, I think, regardless of the size and number of employees that you have. There are a lot of basic things that should be in it. Start with your pay policies, your vacation policies. Those kinds of things is where you get going. There are some, many different services that can help you get an employee handbook as well, including Comply Right can do stuff like that for you. Get people trained on your handbook so everybody is familiar with it, and review it frequently because, as Shannon is saying, these things change all the time. And I keep saying it, I think I said it with record keeping, and I guess I'll say it again with the employee handbook, might not be a bad idea to have a labor attorney take a look at it every couple of years and make sure that you're up to snuff. So that's great stuff, Shanna. Let's move on to our next topic of conversation, which has to be about job applications and interviews. These are all, this is the world of job applications. It's tough. We're trying to find good people, and it's quite the interesting sort of adventure to go on as for an employer because of all the regulations that are out there. For starters, in Philadelphia, where I'm from, you're not allowed to ask about an employee's salary history. And by the way, this is now potentially, that rule in the city might be overturned by the courts, but it's kind of a growing national trend where you're not allowed to ask about employees' salary history. And the idea is that women who are underpaid when compared to men, if you ask what their salary history is, they're automatically starting out sort of behind the 8 ball if you're going to base a salary based on what somebody was making somewhere else. They're trying, the government's trying to make it a level playing field. Tell me some interview questions that I should be avoiding when interviewing somebody.
Okay. Well, the landmine here with job interviews is basically you don't want to ask any questions that are going to identify that candidate identify that candidate's membership into a protected class. Now, I know we just talked about that with the discrimination things, and this kind of goes hand in hand with that. So specifically, you should never ask, how old are you, for example, because that could lead to finding out how, their age, and again, age is a protected class. That question seems obvious, but what about the question, when did you graduate high school? That might not seem so obvious, but that leads pretty much to the same thing, because you're going to find out approximately their age, because most people graduate 17, 18, 19, in that range. So if you do the math, you're going to find out their age.
What if they have that? What if they have that on their resume? Is it okay to ask them then?
Okay, so yeah, obviously there's times when you're asking questions and they just volunteer information. My suggestion on that is to change the subject as soon as possible, obviously, and not ask any follow-up questions. Obviously, you can't unhear things, but don't participate in that conversation. Even if they volunteer the information, just basically move on as fast as possible, because you really don't want to give them any opportunity to say, you didn't hire me because of my age. You didn't hire me because of my religion. That's why you don't want to ask questions that are related to that. And the purpose really of a job interview is to find out if this candidate is a good fit for your position. So what's the best way to do that? The best way to do that is to ask specific job-related probing questions, about the duties of the job. Can they perform the duties of that job? What their age is might not be related to that. For example, is it a job where they have to, are they a UPS driver? Do they need to lift a certain amount of weight? Do they need to stand for a certain period of time? Do they work, is it a factory job, kind of thing like that? So you really want to ask those kinds of questions, not any questions that are going to lead to answers about their religion, about their age, about disability. Instead, you should ask questions. Can you perform the functions of the job? Here are the functions of the job. Can you do this? What's your educational background? What's your work history? Those are the things that you really need to know when you're interviewing.
So it seems like if somebody, from an employer's perspective, if somebody does not get a job, you don't want to put yourself in a position where that candidate could be like, that person didn't hire me because of my age, my gender, my political affiliation. The only thing they should be able to say is that person didn't hire me because of my qualifications for the job.
Exactly.
And that's how you want to keep the conversation.
Exactly.
That's good. So let's go back a little bit. So we talked about that's when we're actually interviewing somebody, but how about the job description? Now, job descriptions seem to me to have changed over the years. I mean, it used to be you could, the more the merrier. You could have sort of lengthy things. I found that job descriptions are sort of trending more on the major sites, the monster.coms and Indeed and Career Builders and all of that. Short and sweet, graphics are included, links back to your website, you're selling your company just as much as you're looking for a candidate. It just seems like those, particularly in a tight labor market, job descriptions themselves have changed. What have you found? What are some of your thoughts on posting a good job description, some things to, mistakes to avoid, and maybe a few best practices you can recommend?
Well, first, I don't know that that's been my experience when I look at a job description, or at least like on a job posting. I do see very lengthy ones, and maybe again it depends on the actual job itself. Maybe if you're looking more of an executive type position versus an entry level, maybe the job descriptions are going to be different. But again, it goes back to what the duties are going to be for the job. What are their expectations themselves? Like, are you going to require a certain educational background? Does the job require certifications? What kind of skills? Those are the things that you really want to put on there. And I think that you should even list things like working conditions. For example, is it an office position or are you going to be working outside? The more information that you can give a candidate, the better. So when if you do call them in for an interview, they know what they're coming in for, as opposed to leaving it very vague. You might be wasting your time. Maybe that person, doesn't want to work outside, for example. And if you put that up front, then they know. So
Right.
you might be saving yourself some time there. And also, the job descriptions are important for, several reasons, though, besides just giving an accurate job description to save yourself time to self-weed out candidates that might not like that job. It also gives you something that you can base your employee performance on. So you can look at that job description, and once you hire that person, you can match them up. Are they doing these duties as required by the job description? And
That makes sense.
another really big one falls under the ADA. So you might under the ADA have to give a reasonable accommodation. So you need to know what the actual essential functions of that job are. So you can tell if a reasonable accommodation might be needed, for example. So there's lots of different reasons why you want to have a good job description.
Good stuff. How about videos during the interviewing process? I mean, there are some technologies coming out. Some of them are, artificially intelligent driven, where you can actually have a video interview and the software can read people's facial expressions, and, or things that they say. It's scary stuff. I mean, but do you have any thoughts on using videos as a tool when you're interviewing people?
I mean, again, everything has its pros and cons, but obviously using video is going to allow you to interview candidates you probably wouldn't have been able to interview before because they just weren't at your location physically. But you're still going to want to follow the same basic interview rules. You're still going to want to make sure you're asking the proper questions. Because remember, if you ever do get a lawsuit filed against you, the video itself could be a evidence in that lawsuit. So you want to make sure you're still following all the rules and still doing everything the most compliant way that you can.
All right, that's great. All right, so that's good. Good tips, good things about job applications and interviewings and finding the right people. So we've got, a few minutes left until we get to our sort of 45-minute time, time ending. And I do want to talk about disciplinary issues in the company. I mean, this is an issue that always vexes a lot of people, what the best processes are to have it, what actually constitutes a disciplinary issue, what is sort of best practices for dealing with the disciplinary issues. So I'll start off with the fourth bullet down about sort of the top disciplinary issues, and then the next one underneath it. Maybe that'll cover, Shanna, in your response, some of the other bullets, which is, what do you find to be some of the biggest issues that you see among your clients, disciplinary issues, and where do you see them screwing up when it comes time to handle these issues? What mistakes do you see them making? And then, of course, what would you recommend to avoid those kinds of mistakes?
Sure. I think the biggest issues that the clients are going to have is any issues that are going to lead to low employee morale, because that's going to lead to low productivity, and also anything that's going to affect productivity. So the typical ones that I see are lack of employee civility, and that could be just from fighting amongst coworkers, for example, insubordination, all the way to bullying and harassing. I mean, if you think about it, those are what's going to lead to the most turnovers. That's what's going to lead to a lot of your lawsuits, and all of those are going to cost you a lot of money. Turnover is very expensive, especially if you have a lot of it, from posting job applications to taking time to interviewing to training and all that stuff, to administrative costs for all the record keeping. So you don't want turnover. That's not the goal. And obviously you want to have the most productivity. So if people aren't happy and they're constantly in a state of conflict, that's going to lead to all that. Another big issue that's going to lead to morale issues and productivity is absenteeism and tardyism. When people are constantly missing work, especially last minute calling in, you might not have the right coverage for everyone. So your employees are gonna start to feel like they're doing two people's jobs but only getting paid for one, because that might actually be the case. Right. So you want to be able to manage time off the best you can. So you want to make sure that you have policies in place where your employees have to give a certain amount of time when possible. Obviously, emergencies are always going to happen. But if somebody wants to take vacation time, maybe you want to require a week or two notice so you can get the proper coverage in there and you're not scrambling at the last minute.
So let's talk about like when actual disciplinary issues happen themselves. What is sort of a best practice for handling it? I mean, I've always told my clients, listen, if there is a problem, somebody's tardy all the time, or there's an inner office problem, whatever it is, and usually it's a violation of something in your handbook, right?
Correct.
That's they're against the company policy. There's if you're going to talk to the employee, I mean, talk us through. I mean, there's documentation. You should be meeting with them with more than one person present. What are some of your recommendations?
Well, first and foremost, I'm going to say be consistent. That's the number one thing that you can do, because you don't want to come out playing favorites. So if one person's late 3 times a week, but they're one of your most productive people, you might not really want to say something to them because you might not want to make them mad, so they stop working so hard when they're actually there. But at the same time, if you let that slide, but then you're calling somebody else out for being late, that's just going to really look bad. So you want to be consistent. Number 2, like you just said, documentation. Very, 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 very important. I can't stress documentation enough. You want to make sure that you're writing down and you're keeping track of all the times that a violation occurs, when you talk to someone, how what the disciplinary measure is that you're taking. But with the documentation, what you want to do is make sure that you are only stating the facts, not your opinions, because again, keep in mind, wrongful termination lawsuit, all of this is fair game in discovery. So a jury, just remember that anything that you write down on paper, a jury might see. So you don't want to say something like, employee X had a bad attitude on this day. Instead, actually, write down the facts of what happened. Employee X was rude to customer XYZ, which violated this policy. So, list the facts. As far as having somebody there to witness it, whenever you do talk to an employee, yes, it's always great to have a witness there. You want to have the witness also sign whatever the documentation is, saying that they were there, this is what happened. And you want to get your employee to sign it too, but employees might be reluctant to, because they might say, I don't agree that I was rude on this, that I was rude to this customer on this day or whatever. So what you want to tell the employee is, listen, you're not signing that you agree, you're assigning that I told you about it. And if they still refuse, then, write that down. Employee refused to sign this document on whatever day. But as long as, you have a witness there too, and they're signing it saying the same thing, then that should be good. A lot of people choose to, whether they realize what they're doing or not, is use what's called progressive discipline. This is where, you start off when you have one violation and you give like a verbal warning, for example. And then there's a second violation, and then you move on to a written warning. And then you can move on to paid suspension. Then you can move on to an unpaid suspension, and then finally termination. The process could be whatever works best for the company. You could do 1 verbal, 2 written, and then termination, or whatever it is. But you want to have a policy in place, and you want to try to keep as consistent as possible. But remember, you also need to leave yourself room for discretion too, because not all violations are the same. So what might be a minor infraction, you can go ahead and do the progressive disciplinary steps. But if you have one major violation, let's say violence in the workplace or theft, for example, that might warrant immediate termination. So you need to make sure in your policy that you leave yourself room to make those discretionary calls.
Shanna, that was great. Boy, I tell you, it's really, really great stuff and great advice that you're giving us. So we've gone over a whole bunch of different things here, all about your record keeping, maintaining your employee handbook, managing job applications, interviews, handling some of these disciplinary issues. Obviously, there are big topics that can be covered all individually, but I think you've shared some great advice with us, and I really, really appreciate it. So thank you. And thanks to all of you for attending and watching this webinar. I hope it was very, very helpful. Shanna, you're going to be doing a Q&A podcast. Do you have a time or a date set for that, or any information to share on that yet?
I don't know when that will be released. We will be sending out, I'm sure, follow-up emails on that. So everybody that's attending today will get a follow-up email with the link to that podcast in the next couple days.
Perfect. All right, that sounds great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And everybody, thank you for sticking around for this webinar. And we'll sign off now, and have a great rest of the day. Take care.
You too.